let's talk about the mouth. I'll give you guys a second here if you haven't already filled in the blanks. There's quite a few of them, I think, on this slide. So those put in. Okay, quite a bit going on with the mouth. Once again, another term for mouth is oral cavity. Includes the following structures. Okay, your lips or labia, which is the fancier term for lips, covered externally by skin and internally by mucous membrane. The junction between the skin and that mucous membrane is highly sensitive. We've kind of talked about that before. Our lips are very important for assisting with eating and forming sounds. Now, everybody take your tongue and stick it in the space there between your lips and your teeth. Okay, right in front, both on the top and the bottom. You should be able to feel a little kind of doodad that's at the kind of bottom of your gum line. Okay, this is called, or these are called your labial frenulum. Okay, frenulum would be singular. I think frenula is how you pluralize it. You have a superior labial frenulum associated with the top lip, and then an inferior labial frenulum associated with your bottom lip. Okay, those just help to attach each lip to the corresponding gum by midline fold. It is just, so it's just a midline fold of mucous membrane. Okay, your cheeks are the lateral boundaries of your oral cavity, continues to the lips and lined by mucous membrane. Okay. The oral cavity or buccal cavity is the space extending from the lips and the teeth to the fauces. So in other words, this is the interior aspect of your mouth. Okay, it's divided into an oral vestibule and an oral cavity proper. Okay, the oral vestibule is a space bounded externally by the cheeks and lips, internally by the gums and the teeth. So when you stuck your tongue in that space there, whether that was on the top or the bottom, that's the oral cavity, or excuse me, the what's it? Should be labeled here. There it is, the vestibule or oral vestibule. That's like if you think about like somebody that's chews tobacco, that's typically where they put that wad of tobacco. Okay, it's just the space between the lips and then the teeth. Okay, that's the much smaller space because the space posterior to the teeth is the oral cavity proper. So it extends from the gums and teeth to the fauces. Fauces, which we talked a little bit about in our last lecture, is the opening between the oral cavity and the oral pharynx. That's the space that we swallow through, and you can see it's labeled here with the kind of line going across, and like so. Let's talk about the hard and the soft palate. These are the roof of your mouth. The hard palate we've talked about before, and that's because it's made up of 4 bones. 2 maxilli, 2 palatines. It forms about the anterior 2/3 of the roof of the mouth. And then the back third is the soft palate. We call that the soft palate because it's made up of muscles, and so it's much softer than the hard bony hard palate. Okay. The soft palate forms a partition between the mouth and the nasopharynx, and is made up of these muscles arranged in an arch structure. There's actually kind of 2 arches, and you can see they're both labeled here. The palatoglossal arch is the more anterior arch, and then the palatopharyngeal arch is the more posterior arch. Okay, located between those 2 arches are those parapalatine tonsils. We can see them labeled, at least one of them here, and then the other one will be over here. Those are the ones that we talked about, typically removed when someone has a tonsillectomy, because those are the ones like, you know, get really inflamed and therefore affect like swallowing and breathing, because they can really kind of pinch shut that fauces. Hanging down from your soft palate, the thing that looks like a little punching bag is what we call the uvula. Okay, this functions to prevent the food and beverages that we swallow from going up into the nose. If you want to kind of see how cool it works, like, you know, use your camera on your phone or look in a mirror, open up your mouth and, you know, do that swallowing mechanism. You'll see it kind of coming up. And so it, along with the epiglottis, kind of prevents stuff from going in the wrong direction. We talked about the epiglottis the other day. That helps us not choke. In this case, this helps keep the stuff out of our nose. Your tongue is a solid mass of skeletal muscle covered by mucous membrane. Helps position food during mastication, which is just a fancy word for chewing, by gathering chewed food in a bolus or a ball in preparation for swallowing. It also helps with forming words. We talked about that the other day. So your tongue itself is a muscle, and there's kind of two types of muscle associated with your tongue. The intrinsic muscles are the muscles that originate and insert in the connective tissue within the tongue. So it's essentially the internal muscles of the tongue, and those are going to help with altering the shape of the tongue for swallowing a speech, and those will be responsible for whether you can roll your tongue and create that kind of U shape to it. The extrinsic muscles are muscles that attach to the skull and neck and move the tongue side to side. So they are kind of located outside the tongue, but they help move it, moving it side to side, in and out as well. Okay. Your third frenulum here that's visible is on the bottom side of the tongue. We call this the lingual frenulum. Anytime you see the word lingual, that is going to be a direct indicator that we're talking about the tongue. Its job is to attach the tongue to the floor of the mouth. You may have heard of like babies being tongue-tied. Sometimes that can be a little bit too big, and then they can have to have it like a little bit snipped. And that's a fairly common process. Lingual glands are found in the lamina propria, the connective tissue of the tongue, and they secrete mucus, any watery serous fluid containing an enzyme called lingual lipase, which we don't get too much into the enzymes in this class. But that enzyme actually helps you digest fats. As far as the tongue goes, it consists of a root, body, and tip, and we've actually seen that before. Back when we talked about taste, we kind of learned about the tongue, and we learned about those little bumps called papillae or papillae on the surface of the tongue. Now, we have a very important picture here. I would put a big fat star, highlight it. Everything that you can see here that's labeled would be fair game for the exam. There's quite a few structures that are in the mouth that you can see here that we haven't talked about yet. And those are the teeth. So let's talk about those. Fill in the blanks. All right, teeth are embedded in the sockets of both the upper and the lower jaw bones. Remember the sockets we learned about back when we talked about the maxillae and the mandible. Those are the three bones. There's two upper jaws and there's the lower jaw bones, the mandible. Those sockets actually have a name that should sound familiar to you if you don't remember. Those sockets are known as alveoli, okay, which is super confusing because we just talked about the alveoli of the lungs, right? Okay, well, the fancy term for these sockets that are in our jaws are alveoli as well. Okay, each tooth is surrounded by gingivae or gingivae, which is a fancy word for gums, and you can see those labeled right there on the previous page. The teeth have a pretty complex structure. There's kind of three major parts to a tooth: a crown, a root, and a neck. You've probably heard of somebody having a crown put on. That's a dental procedure, and essentially is going to mimic the natural crown that our teeth have. Crown is the portion of our tooth that's visible extending out from our gum line, and therefore it's the part of our tooth that we use to chew. Okay. The neck is the portion that's just between the crown and the root, and the neck is essentially at the gum line. The root of the tooth is essentially just like the root of a plant. It's embedded underneath, in this case, underneath and into the jaw. Okay. So like a root of a tree underneath the earth, this is underneath the jawline. Okay. Enamel is a hard, non-living material that covers the crown. Actually happens to be the hardest substance in the body, and it's due to calcium compounds in the enamel, making it very strong and able to withstand, the stress of, everything that we bite into. Sometimes we bite into some pretty tough stuff. It's similar to bone, except it's a little bit harder and it's a little bit different. More like bone is the dentin of our teeth, the calcified tissue, just like bone, which composes the bulk of the tooth. And it's kind of shown here in this kind of orange shade. It kind of looks like a tiger stripe because of these blue lines that we'll talk about here in a second. But the bone-like portion of the tooth is the dentin, and it's deep to the enamel. Okay, those blue lines that look like tiger stripes are called dentinal tubules, and they're parallel microscopic tubules that radiate through the dentin from what we call the pulp cavity. I'll talk about the pulp cavity here in a second. But within these tubules are the processes from odontoblasts, which are the cells that produce the dentin. Odontoblasts are very similar to osteoblasts. If you remember back when we talked about bone, osteoblasts are the bone building cells. They produce, or they take the calcium and make bone out of it. Odontoblasts are what produce the dentin. So they take the calcium and make dentin. There's also fluid here derives the filtrated blood vessels that's found in the pulp cavity. Let's go ahead and talk about the pulp cavity. It's the central cavity inside your tooth. So like bones, your teeth are hollow structures. The cavity is called the pulp cavity, and that's full of what we call pulp, hence the name. You also find there's blood vessels and nerves in there, and that's going to allow for nutrients and waste to be coming in and out. Okay, and then as far as the nerve, it makes our teeth sensitive, and you can feel like cold and pain. Obviously, if you have like a procedure done, they need to deaden your teeth so that when they like drill on it or whatever they do, it's not super painful. Okay. There is also what we call root canal, which is basically just an extension of that pulp cavity, except it projects downward through the root, hence the name root canal, and it travels all the way down to the bottom of the root. And there's an opening at the bottom of that root. In this case, there's kind of two roots. Not all teeth have two roots, but in this case, there's two roots. And that's going to have an apical foramen, which is a hole that allows those nerves and blood vessels to come into the teeth. Okay. You've probably heard of somebody having a procedure called a root canal, which is where they have drilled down into that canal. And it's probably because they've had such a bad cavity that everything's kind of rotted away and they need to clean it up. Doesn't sound very fun. I've never had that procedure done, thankfully. All right, let's talk about cementum, which is bone-like substance that covers the root, functions to bind the tooth to the periodontal ligaments. In our picture here, it's actually labeled as cement for some reason, so it might not be a bad idea to put UM. I think that's just a mistake. But the cementum is this kind of white line you can see on the outside, and these little bands coming off of that cementum is the periodontal ligament. We've talked about the periodontal ligament before. I do want you to know this picture. I would say everything in it would be fair game, with the exception you don't need to worry about alveolar process, nerve, and blood supply at the bottom. But everything that's bold and then the three parts on the left would be okay. Now, humans have two dentitions, or two sets of teeth, what we call our deciduous teeth and our permanent teeth. If you think like a deciduous tree, you've heard of that term before. Those are the types of trees that like lose their leaves in the fall. Deciduous teeth, what we would commonly call our baby teeth, also go by primary milk teeth, are the ones that appear as babies around 6 months of age, and then those are the ones that fall out. Okay, approximately 2 teeth appear each month after that first set come in, or that first one comes in, until all 20 are present. So we have 20 of those original teeth, and you can see those are labeled here in this illustration on the bottom left. They are labeled with letters, whereas our permanent or secondary teeth are numbered. Okay, you have 16 on top, 16 on bottom for a total of 32. Okay, and those are going to start coming in generally between 6 and 12 years of age. And you know, I've got a 6-year-old right now. He's lost 2 or 3, something like that, maybe even 4. I can't remember. But he lost them actually when he was 5. So it's all kind of different for each individual. Now, humans can be described as having differentiated teeth. Anybody have any idea what that means? It means not all of our teeth are the exact same. We have different types of teeth, and that enables humans, not all humans choose to do this, but it enables us to be omnivorous, which means that we can eat both plants and meat. Okay, not all animals and not all animals have this same situation. If you think like herbivorous animals, like cows that graze on grass and hay, they aren't going to have the same types of teeth that we have because they don't have to rip into meat and tear at it. And you think about like predominantly meat eating animals, they're going to have a lot more of the sharp teeth that are great for ripping and tearing at the meat. We'll start by talking about the incisors. The incisors are total number of 8 of them are important for biting or / cutting into your food. These are the teeth, and I always tell students to use your tongue to kind of feel them, that are shaped like a chisel. They have a kind of a sharp edge to them, and they are the ones that are in the front. So we've got 4 on the top and then 4 on the bottom. There's 2 centrals. These will be, we commonly call like our butt teeth. Those are the teeth that typically come in first, and then the teeth that we lose first. And you have those 2 top 2 or top bottom 2. Those are the centrals, and then the 2 on the sides of those are the lateral incisors. Okay, they only have 1 root, whereas what we can see here, like I said, they have 2 in that picture. And that's because this is not an incisor. And if you feel with your tongue from those sharp chisel-like teeth, you're gonna then feel kind of some pointy teeth. These are what we commonly call our canines or our cuspids. There's gonna be 1 on each side. So there's 4 total, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and these are very good at ripping and tearing in your food. Okay, and so this is like what meat-eating animals have. They call them canines because what animals do you see these in? Dogs. Canines are dogs, wolves, foxes. Okay, if you think about, you know, Dracula, you know, the pointed fangs that he would have, that would be this type of tooth. It comes to a point. So there's a pointed surface known as a cusp, and like incisors, they only have 1 root. Okay, from there, if you take your tongue, you're going to start to kind of feel some teeth that have some kind of points, but also are a little bit flattened in between those points. Those are what you would call your premolars or bicuspids. There's 8 total of those that are good for chewing and grinding food. The premolars, there's first and seconds, and you can see those are labeled first, second, and there's going to be 2 on each side, both top and bottom. 2 cusps and 1 root is what they will have. And then towards the back of your mouth are where you'll find the flat teeth, and that's what actually is visible here. There are 8 total of these traditional molars. They're very good at chewing and grinding food. This is the type of tooth that you're going to find in the mouth of, you know, your plant eating animals, really good at grinding because of that flat surface that they have. There are the first and second molars. You can see those are labeled there and there. And each of them has 4 cusps, 4 kind of little points. And then you can see like those are the cusps and then the space in between. You have maxillary upper molars, which have 3 roots, and then mandibular lower molars, which usually only have 2. I don't really know why the difference exists, but that's typically the case. And then there are a 3rd set of molars, or your wisdoms, which are the ones that typically come in around, the years that you're in college, and typically need to be removed because of what they do. They cause overcrowding. Interestingly enough, and teeth are kind of weird from person to person. They don't develop in all people. Some people get all four. Some people only get one or two. Some people, don't have any. I like to think of myself as genetically gifted because I was born without any. So my dad apparently had the same situation. I was pretty lucky to inherit that somehow, whatever, and never had to have that procedure done like a lot of students do. As far as these two images on the right, you don't need to worry about them. Like I said, you do need to know this one on the left. And then, if you go back to the previous page, you can see they're all labeled, not specifically as like the first molars, second molars, third molars, or anything like that. So that's fine. You can just, worry about how it's labeled here on that picture. Couple pictures here on the next page. We've got a child's jaw where we can see their permanent teeth kind of coming in and their baby teeth, still out. We can actually see kind of their roots sticking into the jaws, which is pretty cool. It's kind of weird looking and seeing this, but it's still pretty cool at the same time. And then here on the next page, really cool picture where they've kind of removed the jaw to show you the vascularization and the nerves coming into those teeth and how that's all intertwined. Pretty cool stuff. The final structures associated with the mouth are your salivary glands, which produce the saliva, obviously. What we commonly call our spit. A very important fluid that helps us with swallowing, especially, but also with digestion. As far as saliva goes, it's mostly water. About 99.5% of it is water. The rest includes some digestive enzymes, salivary amylase, which helps us digest carbohydrates, lingual lipase, which helps us digest fats, as I already mentioned. There's also lysozyme, which helps kill bacteria. There's also proteins. There's even antibodies and several different types of ions. Okay. Now, the inner lining, the mucous membranes of our mouth and tongue, contain many small salivary glands that open directly or indirectly via short ducts to the oral cavity. These include the labial, the buccal, the palatal glands, which are associated with the lips, cheeks, and palate, respectively. So the inside of your lips, inside of your cheeks, top of your mouth, those all produce a little bit of saliva. So does your tongue, those lingual glands, as we've already mentioned. But those only contribute a very small amount to your saliva. Most of your saliva actually is secreted by your major salivary glands, which are located outside of the oral cavity and connect to it by way of some duct systems, okay? The largest of our major salivary glands are the parotid glands, which are named because they're pretty near to the ear. They are in your cheeks, just superficial to that big masseter muscle that we've talked about before. And their duct is going to connect to the oral cavity between the molars and the upper part of our mouth. The submandibular glands or mixed glands are located underneath the jawline, and they are going to deliver the saliva on both sides of that lingual frenulum. If I go back to this picture, you can see the two little openings there are actually labeled. Those are the ones that sometimes, like if you yawn, that saliva will shoot out of there. They call that gleeking. It's from the salivary glands known as submandibular. And then underneath of the tongue, which is where their name comes from, sublingual glands are going to only be visible here because we've removed kind of part of the jawline. Looking here in the cadaver, you can't see it, and that's because the jaw has not been removed. But the sublingual glands have several little ducts that deliver their secretions beneath the tongue. I do want you to know this image, and it's really just the three glands. You don't need to worry about the ducts or anything else. So here, where the parotid glands labeled, and then the submandibular, and then the sublingual glands on the bottom. So nothing too crazy there, hopefully. Anyway. Pretty cool to see here in the cadaver, the good size of that parotid gland. You can see the submandibular kind of pointing down underneath. So pretty cool stuff. All right, moving on finally from the mouth, which took us several slides to do. We can now talk about where the food goes next when we swallow it, which includes the pharynx, which we talked quite a bit about the other day, and then the esophagus, which I mentioned just briefly the other day. Okay, the act of swallowing has a fancy name, just like the act of chewing, which we said earlier was mastication. Swallowing is deglutition. And this is going to move a food mass, what we call a bolus, from our mouth, but not just into the throat. It's all the way to the stomach. So it's going to involve not just the mouth, but it's also going to involve the pharynx and the esophagus. So we're going to talk about those things here all together. The pharynx, as we've learned, is a funnel-shaped tube extending from the internal nares to the esophagus posteriorly to the larynx anteriorly. Okay, it needs to pass that bolus when we swallow to the esophagus through two of its three segments, and that's because once again the nasopharynx is not involved because that's behind the nose, and we're not swallowing through our nose, we're swallowing through the mouth. So that bolus travels through the oro and then the laryngopharynx, unless it's a liquid and we're swallowing it instead of a bolus. Okay. Structurally, it's made up of skeletal muscle and is lined by a mucous membrane, and we talked about all that the other day. And the esophagus is a collapsible muscular mucosa lined tube extending from the pharynx to the stomach. So it is similar to the trachea in that it's a tube that carries something, but very different from the trachea in that it's collapsible. Remember, the trachea is made up of that C-shaped cartilage, which prevents it from collapsing. The esophagus absolutely does collapse. And the esophagus is about 25 centimeters or 10 inches in length, and about 4 centimeters or about 1.5 inches in diameter. So it's about the same size as the larynx or as the trachea. It's actually a little bit wider. Lies posterior to the trachea and actually runs behind the heart as well. And the key function of it is to push a bolus towards the stomach via muscle contractions known as peristalsis, not necessarily gravity. Okay, gravity obviously does help, but it's not necessary. In fact, you can actually swallow while inverted, although that's obviously not recommended. So in other words, you can be upside down, take a drink of water, swallow some food, something that a college student might do, like standing upside down over a keg. Not necessarily recommended, but it is possible to still get that, in that case, beer from their mouth and into their stomach. Now, at the top and at the bottom of the esophagus is a muscular sphincter, what we call the upper esophageal and the lower esophageal sphincters, which act as valves to regulate the passage of this material that we are swallowing. These are like the valves that we've been talking about here lately, like the valves in the heart, which only allow blood to go forward. In this case, they're hopefully only going to allow the food or the liquid to go forward. The upper esophageal sphincter is located at the top of the esophagus between it and the larynx. Okay. The kind of more important, in my opinion, sphincter is down at the bottom, and it's essentially at the top of the stomach, and we call this the lower esophageal sphincter, which also goes by the term the cardiac sphincter, not because it's associated with the heart in any way, but essentially the apex of your heart is right here. And so I guess that's where that term comes from, because it's close by where the heart is. This controls the movement of food out of the esophagus into the stomach and prevents, hopefully anyway, reflux. Okay, GERD, which is short for gastroesophageal reflux disease, is the term used to describe the backflow of stomach acid up through the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, the stomach, as we'll find out here in just a second, is very suited to the very acidic nature of its contents. Okay. The esophagus is not built in that manner. So if any acid backs up into your esophagus, you're going to feel it. Okay. That reflux condition, what we commonly call heartburn, is not your heart obviously burning, but it feels like your heart is burning because your heart is right here and the esophagus is just right behind it. It's actually the hydrochloric acid from the stomach kind of eating away at that inner mucosa of the esophagus. Here's actually a really cool picture of the layers of the esophagus. We can see that mucosa. Gives you a good view of how collapsible it really is, and pretty neat to see. Now, your esophagus actually has to pierce through the diaphragm, an opening, what we call the esophageal hiatus. It's one of the many openings that has to be in the diaphragm. The other being, associated with like the aorta and the inferior vena cava that we have previously talked about. The act of swallowing, once again, is deglutition, a complex process requiring coordinated rapid movements. It involves 3 stages. The oral stage is where the food is, or the bolus, I should say, is going from the mouth to the oropharynx. It's the only of the 3 phases that's voluntarily controlled. Okay. That formation of a food bolus in the middle of the tongue enables the tongue then to press that bolus up against the palate, and then the food is pushed into the oropharynx. After that point, it's completely involuntarily controlled, and that includes both the pharyngeal and the esophageal stages. In the pharyngeal stage, the bolus is going to move from the oropharynx and then into the esophagus. To propel that bolus from the pharynx to the esophagus, the mouth, the nasopharynx, and larynx must be blocked. Combination of contractions and gravity help do this. And then the final stage, and I imagine it's probably the longest stage, is the esophageal stage, and that's just because the esophagus is the longest segment. Another involuntary movement where contraction and gravity help move it into the stomach. Now, to prevent aspiration or choking and prevent stuff from going up into the nasopharynx, our uvula, remember that's the little ball-like structure at the back of the mouth, pulls upward to close off the nasopharynx. The larynx gets closed off thanks to the protection of 2 things: the epiglottis, which slides down, and then the larynx actually gets pulled forward under the protection of the tongue. So when that food comes down, it slides over the epiglottis and the esophagus. The vocal cords that we talked about the other day close to block the airway some more. And it takes about 2 seconds, but our breathing has to stop or cease while the above takes place. So you can't obviously breathe and eat or drink at the same time. As far as the 2 images go, you don't need to worry about them for the exam. There's really just nothing specific that's necessary to know. All right, moving on. Just like our bolus would, the next stop will be the stomach. Here we're going to see the word gastric a lot. Anytime you see the word gastric, that's going to be a direct indicator that you are dealing with the stomach. All right, this is a portion of the digestive tube that has the ability to dilate or expand into an elongated pouch-like structure. So in other words, it can stretch, and that accommodates that, surge of food that fills it up. Okay, and that's capable of happening because it's got some extra special features, what we call rugae or gastric folds, which are specialized structures of the mucosal membrane. Essentially, it's really cool to see them here in the cadaver view, which was essentially where the front of the stomach's been removed. You can kind of see these accordion-like folds. Okay, well, y'all hopefully know what a accordion is, that type of instrument that has the little keys, and then you can swing it back and forth by moving your arms in and out. Okay, those gastric folds or rugae, when the stomach is empty, fold inward, but when the stomach needs to fill up, the stomach stretches and those flatten out. Okay. Once again, those are specialized features or specialized structures of the mucosal layer. Location of the stomach is in the upper part of the abdominal cavity near the liver and the diaphragm. Functions to mix saliva, food, and gastric juice, which is the juice that the stomach produces, which forms chyme. Okay, I'm going to try to avoid using the term food at this point, because when that food makes its way into the stomach and that gastric juice mixes up with it, it's no longer just food anymore. It's food plus this other stuff, and that's why we will call it chyme. Your stomach also serves as a reservoir for that, I say food there, but you can say chyme. Before being released into the small intestine, we secrete gastric juice to aid in digestion, and we actually even secrete hormones, and that includes gastrin into the blood, which helps us do different things related to digestion. And we've talked about this before, but the stomach with its hydrochloric acid, HCl, actually is very strong acid, and that will kill a lot of bacteria. Each of your, I shouldn't say each, you have one stomach, but your stomach is made up of 4 different segments or sections, and they are bracketed off here with the dotted lines. Obviously, these dotted lines don't exist here in the real stomach, so this is kind of imaginary lines. The smallest and first part I want to talk about is the cardia. Cardia is the collar-like region at the junction of the esophagus, and that's where you find that lower esophageal or cardiac sphincter that we just talked about. Above that, it's kind of a weird little area, is the fundus. It's a large portion to the left and above the opening of the esophagus into the stomach. The body is the biggest region of the stomach. You can see it's labeled right there. It's just the central portion. And then the pyloric part is the lower part of the stomach that connects the stomach to the small intestine. And that's where it kind of starts to taper and get skinnier as it reaches that junction with the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. This pyloric part actually consists of 3 different distinctive parts. Okay? The pyloric antrum, which connects to the body of the stomach. That's this kind of triangular shaped area that's labeled there. The second part is the pyloric canal, which is going to lead to the third segment, which is the pylorus. And that's what connects to the duodenum of the small intestine. Located in that pylorus region and help guarding it is another sphincter. This is going to be our third sphincter, not the last. We're going to see a couple more. But the pyloric sphincter is what regulates the movement of that chyme out of the stomach. Okay? And it allows just a little bit of that chyme out of the stomach at a time. It takes several hours to empty your stomach, depending on what you eat and how much. It can take about 6 hours on the high end, and about 2 hours on the kind of the low end. So when people eat a meal and then 30 minutes later they need to go to the bathroom and they say, "Man, that ran through me," they are full of it because they haven't even moved that food out of their stomach yet. But when you fill up your stomach, that kind of gets the intestines moving a little bit more, and then you're going to need to go to the bathroom to remove what you ate much earlier in the day or even the day before. There's kind of 2 different curvatures associated with the stomach. There's the lesser curvature kind of on the inside here, and then the much larger, greater curvature. Okay, so the concave medial border of the stomach is the lesser, convex lateral border is the greater. Okay. Associated with the mucosal layer, aside from those rugae, are specialized structures called gastric pits. And we can see those here in the picture on the right, where we've kind of zoomed in. We show those 4 layers that we talked about the other day: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. These gastric pits are exactly what it kind of sounds like. Indentations of the stomach where you're going to find specialized cells. And we're going to talk about those cells. Okay, there's kind of 2 types of cells. There's those that are exocrine in nature, which means that they collectively create the gastric juice that's dumped into the lumen of the stomach, and those that are endocrine, which means that they release hormones that enter the blood supply. Okay, those that are exocrine include the following, and we can see them labeled here with our kind of zoom in at one of those gastric pits. There's two types of mucus cells. There's those that are called surface mucus cells, and those are called mucus neck cells. Their job is the exact same. It's to produce mucus. Okay, it's just their location that's what's different about them. The ones that are surface are closer to the surface of the pit. The ones that are the neck cells are down farther into the pit. Okay. Now, the mucus that is produced by the stomach is very, very important. It creates a really thick coating on the inside of the stomach, which helps protect against the acid and digestive enzymes that's in the rest of the gastric juice. So that's why, you know, the hydrochloric acid doesn't burn holes in your stomach like it could do to just about anywhere else in the body, including the esophagus, if you leave that reflux untreated. Okay. Then you have what we call parietal or oxyntic cells, which they're labeled here as parietal cells, and that's how I really want you to focus on knowing them. Those are the cells that secrete the hydrochloric acid, but also secrete what's called intrinsic factor, which I'm not really going to get into what that is. And then chief or zymogenic cells, and I just care about you knowing them as chief cells because that's what they're labeled as here. Those secrete pepsinogen, which is a precursor to the enzyme pepsin that helps us digest proteins, and gastric lipase, which along with that lingual lipase we just mentioned helps digest fats. And for those of you who are in physiology, we're going to talk more about those enzymes later today. The endocrine cells include enteroendocrine or G cells, which secrete various hormones like gastrin, which stimulate other stomach glands to increase their output. So essentially, the gastrin hormone basically tells these other cells to start dumping their secretions into the lumen of the stomach. And once again, those are all things associated with the mucosa layer, okay? Just this inner lining of the stomach. I'm not really going to mention too much about the submucosa or the serosa, but I do want to note that the muscularis is unique. And I kind of talked about this the other day, and we can see them labeled here in this image. There's 3 layers of smooth muscle, whereas what we'll see here for the small intestine and the large intestine, for example, there's only 2. Okay. In the case of the stomach, they have a longitudinal layer, which is on the outside, and then a circular layer, and then an oblique layer, which is the innermost layer. In the case of the small intestine, large intestine, there's just the longitudinal and circular layers. There is no obliques. That's the unique layer that the stomach has that the other GI structures don't. I do want you to know this image. Letter A here, figure A, is a very important image to know. Pretty much any and everything that you can see there would be fair game for the exam. It does have, you know, for example, the cirrhosis labeled. You know, I pointed it out that it is obviously part of the stomach, but I didn't really talk about it. You can see all the different regions, all the different structures we talked about. Not going to worry about any of the other pictures. Not going to worry about this one that I included on the next page. This is kind of cool. It's kind of just a different version of what you can see here, where you can see the different layers. This actually, it would be this picture to show you those pits. Kind of cool to see, and you can see the cells, the surface cells, mucus cells, parietal cells, chief cells, so on and so forth. There's the G cells. Not that you need to worry about that. Now, if we were going to continue down the line of the tract, the next organ we would be talking about would be receiving that chyme from the stomach, and that would be your small intestine. What we're going to do is we're going to take a detour for a couple slides and talk about some accessory organs. And that includes the pancreas and then the liver and gallbladder on the next slide. And you'll find out kind of why we're taking this detour. Thinking back just a few weeks ago, we talked about the pancreas with regards to its role in producing hormones. So we talked about it back in our endocrine lecture. Well, we've learned a little bit about some of this stuff, but I'll go ahead and read through it. Again, it's a retroperitoneal organ, which means that it's behind that peritoneum that we talked about the other day. It lies posterior to the greater curvature of the stomach. So if you were to find it, you'd have to move the stomach out of the way. About 5 to 6 inches long. It tapers right to left. And so it kind of comes to a point over there on your left side of your abdomen, just like so. There's kind of 3 major parts, and we've talked about them before: the head, the body, and the tail. The head lies to the right, nestled in the duodenal sweep. So that would be this kind of like duodenal curvature. The body is in the middle, and then the tail is where it comes to the point there on the left side. Okay. That tail terminates at the junction with the spleen. So in this image, it would be right here. And we've actually seen that before, so not a big deal. Posterior wall of the stomach lies against the anterior surface of the pancreas. The word pancreas actually means all flesh because of its ability to digest virtually all proteins. 99% of the cells of the pancreas create what's called pancreatic juice. These cells are called acini or acinar cells, as you'll sometimes see them listed. Okay. And they create the pancreatic juice that then drains out of the pancreas thanks to a pretty complicated duct system. Okay. And all of that pancreatic juice is going to end up being dumped into the duodenum. And so that's why we're going to talk about the pancreas along with the liver and the gallbladder that you can see here in the picture, because they secrete what's called bile that also ends up in the duodenum as well. Okay. Now, there are 2 major ducts that drain this pancreatic juice into the small intestine, what we call the pancreatic duct and the accessory duct, which also have some special names. They're kind of the traditional terms. I don't care about you knowing them. But the pancreatic duct is the larger of the 2 ducts. And in most people, it joins, and you can see it if I zoom in a little bit, with this green duct, which is the common bile duct that's coming down from the liver and the gallbladder. That pancreatic duct and the common bile duct unite, and that's what's visible here. And I really like how they've color coded it purple and green because it's going to be a combination of the 2. This short little union is called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And so this little area is going to contain pancreatic juice, but also bile coming down from that common bile duct. And together, those chemicals get dumped into the small intestine right there. Okay. That opening is called, where's it at? The major duodenal papilla. There it is, right there. Okay. The ampulla opens on an elevation on the duodenal mucosa, known as the major duodenal papilla. It lies about 10 centimeters or 4 inches inferior to that pyloric sphincter. Remember the pyloric sphincter we just learned is that smooth muscle right there at the end of the small, or at the end of the stomach before the small intestine. So essentially all this stuff is just a few inches below that. Okay. Now, this passage of pancreatic juice from the pancreas and bile from the liver and gallbladder is regulated by another sphincter. And this sphincter has kind of a very long name, sphincter of the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Also goes by the term sphincter of Oddi, not that you need to know that. But that's this muscle that surrounds the tube. The tube itself is the ampulla. The papilla is where it opens. And then the sphincter is what controls the release of that fluid. Does that make sense? Okay. There is another duct, and it's much smaller, and it doesn't carry as much pancreatic juice. And this is just called the accessory duct. Okay. It leads from the pancreas emptying into the duodenum just about 2.5 centimeters, right about an inch above the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. Now, once again, we've already talked about the pancreas back in our endocrine lecture. We learned that about 1% of the cells, what we call pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans, secrete hormones that empty into the bloodstream, which include things like insulin and glucagon, as well as a couple others. So I'm not going to really talk anymore about that. As far as pancreas goes, it's very richly supplied with arteries and veins, and you can see all the different arteries that vascularize it. I'm not going to read through them. We've already talked about those before. Major nerves innervating the pancreas are the vagus nerves, which provide parasympathetic innervation. Down at the bottom is a pretty cool picture to show you a cadaver's pancreas has been opened up, and you can see that very large pancreatic duct. Here you can see the common bile duct. This is all part of the small intestine here. You can kind of see where those would be coming together. It's kind of hard to tell where exactly they do, but here's where they open up. There's that papilla that was mentioned up here. You can see the little opening, which is going to allow that pancreatic juice and the bile to come into the small intestine. Now, as far as this picture goes, I'm going to have you highlight some stuff in it, but let's go ahead and talk about the liver and the gallbladder first, because obviously you can see them and structures associated with them as well. All right, let's start by talking about the largest internal organ of the body. It's your liver, not the largest organ. Your skin is bigger than it, but it is the largest internal organ. Weighs approximately 1.5 kilos or 3 pounds, so it's not super heavy, but it is significantly big in size. Its job is to aid in digestion by producing the bile that I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. But it also helps perform metabolism, and that would be of our carbs, our proteins, and our fats. It performs detoxification, so it detoxifies different chemicals and whatnot that can be in the body. Stores vitamins and minerals, performs phagocytosis, excretes bilirubin, which is something that happens when we break down and start to recycle hemoglobin. It activates vitamin D, and it processes drugs and hormones. And there are two principal lobes to the liver, a right lobe and a left lobe, and you can see they are obviously not of equal size, but they are split by that falciform ligament that we talked about the other day. The right lobe is about 5/6 of the liver, and then the left lobe is only about 1/6. Okay. Now you can subdivide the right lobe into an inferior quadrate lobe and a posterior caudate lobe. You can't see either of those here in the picture, but that's okay. If I go to the next page, we've got a posterior inferior surface view of the liver. So the liver is kind of looking at the bottom of it, which gives you a good view of the gallbladder. But here we can see the big right lobe. Here's the big left lobe, and that also gives us a view of the caudate and the quadrate lobes. Okay. Now, each of those lobes are then subdivided into hepatic lobules. A hepatic lobule is just the anatomical unit or the anatomical units. There's not just one, there's many, many, many of them of our liver. Here we can see what one of those lobules looks like. Okay. Within each lobule are hepatocytes, which are the major functional cells of the liver, arranged in layers that radiate out from a central vein. And so if I come down to this image, zoom in a little bit, here's the central vein, which gets its name because it's probably at the center. But then you can see the cells, which are all these kind of brownish shaded cells, are circling around that, kind of like trees or rings on a tree trunk. Okay, those are the hepatocytes. You also see radiating out from that central vein are these blue blood vessels called hepatic sinusoids. So let me read through and explain what's what. Hepatic sinusoids are highly permeable blood capillaries between the rows of hepatocytes that receive oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery and nutrient-rich deoxygenated blood from the hepatic portal vein. Remember, the hepatic portal vein we discussed in our last unit was going to carry blood from things like your stomach and your intestines directly to the liver before having to be delivered to the rest of the body. And in that blood are lots and lots of nutrients, so that's why it's described as nutrient-rich. blood, it's got like carbohydrates and proteins in it, as well as vitamins and minerals that we've absorbed. Okay. Those are the blood vessels coming into the liver. Okay. The hepatocytes, or excuse me, the hepatic sinusoids converge and deliver that blood to the central vein. So in other words, the blood is going in this direction to the center of each of the lobules. Okay. From there, then the blood is going to flow into the hepatic veins, which drain into the inferior vena cava, which delivers the blood back to our heart, as we know. Okay. Now, as that blood comes in to the liver, those hepatocytes are going to do stuff with the carbs and the proteins and whatnot. They're going to metabolize it and do the different things. They're also going to be producing lots and lots of bile. And that's, like I said, something that the liver does. In fact, that's one of the major functions of those hepatocytes, which is to secrete the bile, a liquid that helps with digestion of fats. Okay. That bile that's created by those hepatocytes is not going to get dumped into the bloodstream, but instead is going to go into eventually the small intestine thanks to a duct network, kind of similar to what we talked about with the pancreas. It begins with what we call bile canaliculi, small ducts between the hepatocytes. They collect the bile from the hepatocytes. From there, the bile passes into bile ductules and then to bile ducts. If we look at the image on the right here, we can see shown in green, these tiny little bile canaliculi. Going to collect the bile, then that drains eventually into a bile duct. And then there are two major bile ducts associated with the liver. Okay? A right hepatic duct, which is associated with the right lobe, and then a left hepatic duct, which is obviously associated with the left lobe. Okay. Now those carry the bile down where they then come together, forming what's called a common hepatic duct. Now the bile is going to go in two directions at this point. Okay. Some of that bile is going to go straight down to your small intestine. Some of it's going to come up and into the gallbladder, because the gallbladder's job is just to help store extra bile. Okay. And that bile is going to come into the gallbladder by way of its cystic duct. Okay. When it is time to dump a whole bunch of bile into the small intestine, the gallbladder is going to contract because it's got some muscle on the inside of it, forcing the bile back out into the cystic duct. Together, the cystic duct and the common hepatic duct converge, which creates the common bile duct. Okay. If you need to kind of keep your head straight on how all this works, this is a nice little flow chart. And like I say, that is pun intended. Right hepatic duct, left hepatic duct form the common hepatic duct. Here's the cystic duct from the gallbladder. When those two unite, that forms the common bile duct. And as we just learned on the previous page, common bile duct and the pancreatic duct join together. And that's what forms that hepatopancreatic ampulla, that little tube which contains both bile and pancreatic juice. And so once again, gallbladder, its job is to store and concentrate bile that's produced by liver until it's needed in the small intestine. It's located in a depression on the posterior surface of the liver. So technically you wouldn't be able to see it here in this image, with the exception of just this little doodad hanging down from the bottom. If I go back, let's see. Like right here, you can see the two lobes of the liver very nicely, but you can just barely see the gallbladder kind of hanging down from underneath. And that's just because it's more located on the bottom and back side of the liver. And there's three parts to this short, small organ. It's only about 3 to 4 centimeters or 3 to 4 inches in length, but it does consist of a broad fundus. That's the part that you can see down here at the bottom. Then in the middle is the body, which is the central portion. And then the tapered portion is the neck that leads to that cystic duct. Okay. I've already kind of talked about everything here, so I will move on. Looking here is the image that I want you to know. And I'm actually going to go back to the previous page where I have it again. It's just a little bit bigger on this page, so you can kind of see some stuff a little bit better. Here's the stuff that I want you to highlight. I'll just start here on the bottom left and I'll go clockwise. I do want you to know the hepatopancreatic ampulla, the accessory duct, the duodenum, the fundus, the body, the neck, and the gallbladder just as a whole. I hate when they do this, but they have the cystic duct labeled in the picture. Highlight that. Same thing from the right hepatic duct in the right lobe of the liver. Highlight the falciform ligament on top, left lobe of the liver, left hepatic duct, common hepatic duct, common bile duct, pancreas, its tail, its body, the pancreatic duct, and then the pancreatic head. I'm not going to worry about the little box over here on the right where we're zoomed in on things. It will help you study, hopefully, but you don't need to worry about studying it for the exam. All right, now we can finally get back to talking about the gastrointestinal tract. We'll do so by talking about the small intestine. Now keep in mind, this is ileum, not lleum, that's ileum. This is the longest organ of the body. Very long organ. So its name does not come from its length. Its name, small intestine, comes from its small diameter. It's kind of skinny. Think of it very comparable visually to a garden hose. It's long like a garden hose and it's pretty skinny like a garden hose. Okay. Okay, its diameter is about 2.5 centimeters or an inch. Its length is around 3 meters, which is around 10 feet. So very, very long. It is the main site of absorption in the digestive tract. So this is where most of the stuff that we've ingested actually gets to enter the bloodstream or the lymphatic stream. Okay, and it's also the main site of digestion, chemically anyway. It does also perform mechanical digestion through segmentation, peristalsis. But the chemical digestion that takes place here comes by way of various enzymes. Okay, those enzymes include those coming from the pancreas. There's a lot of different enzymes in that pancreatic juice. The bile, as we just learned, helps with digestion of fats. But the pancreas also creates its own enzymes, and we'll get to those here in just a little bit. Those come from what we call the brush border. Okay. There's 3 regions or divisions to the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. I've actually had professors when I was in school pronounce duodenum several different ways. I had one that called it duodenum. I had another that called it the duodenum. I've always just called it the duodenum. It's the shortest region, and that's the part that we've already been talking about. It runs from the pyloric sphincter to the stomach of the from a pyloric sphincter of the stomach to the ligament of Treitz, receives chyme from the stomach through that pyloric sphincter, has a C shape and is only about 25 centimeters or 10 inches in length. So it's not even quite a foot. Okay, so it's about 10% of the total length of the small intestine. The jejunum runs from the ligament of Treitz to the ileum and is about 1 meter or 3 feet in length. So if you add those two together, this is about a foot, this is about 3. There's about 4 out of our 10 feet, which means the longest is our ileum, and that's about 6 feet. And this is not only the longest, but it's the final region. Runs from the mid-small bowel to the ileocecal sphincter or the ileocecal valve. Sometimes you'll see it listed that way, which is located at the junction between it and the large intestine. It's called the ileocecal sphincter because it's between the ileum of the small intestine and the cecum, cecal for cecum, of the large intestine. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Okay. Function of this sphincter is to regulate the movement of chyme into the large intestine and prevent backward movement of material into the small intestine. So it's super long, and its length alone provides a large surface area for digestion and absorption. But that surface area is further increased by 3 special features. Okay? And we can see them in a variety of the pictures at the bottom. I'll start by talking about the largest features. These are called circular folds or plicae, which are folds of the mucosa and submucosa, which are about 10 millimeters in length. These would be visible to the naked eye, and we can see them here in the small intestine, where essentially the kind of front of it's been removed. Here, where we've zoomed in, we can see what that internal view looks like, kind of like the folds that we saw in the stomach, except these aren't built for like in the stomach where we're trying to elongate and distend, expand the stomach. These just increase surface area contact between the food, or as we should say, chyme, and the intestinal wall. Okay. In the illustration, they kind of show them here like so. Extending off of those finger-like folds are finger-like projections that are much smaller, about 0.5 to 1 millimeter in length, called villi. Okay, villi is plural, whereas the word villus is singular. So if I zoom in, you can see here we've looked at 2 of those circular folds, and you can see coming off of those are these little finger-like extensions, each of which is called a villus. Okay, and each villus on the inside of it contains an arteriole bringing blood in, a venule bringing blood out, and in between them is the capillary network. This is where most of the stuff that we are absorbing into the bloodstream goes. So for example, this is where glucose and other carbohydrates come into the blood, amino acids come in. What we also find are those special lymphatic vessels that we talked about previously. Remember, those lacteals are a special type of lymphatic capillary, and this is where the fats that we absorb get picked up. Remember, fats don't go directly into the bloodstream, they go into the lymphatic system, and that's thanks to what we call lacteals. Okay. So villi are the finger-like projections, okay, where you find arterioles, venules, blood capillary network, and a lacteal or lymphatic capillary. Okay. Now, there are several different types of cells that you find throughout the lacteals. The first type of cells are called absorptive cells, and if you notice, they have little finger-like extensions called microvilli associated with them. Okay. So what you have are large folds, and each large fold has lots and lots of little finger-like extensions, and a good number of the cells on those finger-like extensions have tinier finger-like extensions. So there's folds on folds on folds, and that once again just increases surface area, which makes digestion and absorption much more prominent. Okay, those cells that have those microvilli are literally called absorptive cells, which tells you exactly what they do. They're the ones that allow the stuff to go into the blood. That's what absorption is. Okay, those microvilli allow for the substances to come through the cell and eventually into the blood or to the lymphatic system. Okay, those also produce what we call brush border enzymes, and those enzymes include lactase. If you ever heard of somebody being lactose intolerant, lactase is what helps us digest lactose, that sugar that you find in like milk. Okay, there's also maltase and sucrase. Sucrase helps us digest like sugars. Okay, they're called brush border enzymes because the microvilli of these cells sometimes referred to as a brush border, because it looks like a little tiny brush. Okay. There's also goblet cells, just like goblet cells we talked about the other day. They secrete mucus that helps protect the epithelial layer from digestion. There's also Paneth cells. We can see those down here. They secrete lysozyme, which helps kill bacteria. And then there's enteroendocrine cells that secrete 3 different types of hormones: secretin, cholecystokinin, or GIP, which I can't ever remember. It's a really long word. And you don't need to worry about it anyway. But those release hormones into the bloodstream, and those regulate different aspects of digestion. Now, there's several glands located throughout the walls of our intestine. In the mucosa, our intestinal glands, or crypts of Lieberkühn, they secrete the intestinal juice. In the submucosa, you have duodenal or Brunner's glands, and they secrete an alkaline mucus, which is essentially a mucus that's opposite of something that's acidic. And together, those neutralize one another, which is great because just like the esophagus, your small intestine is not built for that gastric acid that you find released in your stomach. And within the lamina propria of the mucosa, we find an abundance of those mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues, or MALT. Remember, those are those lymph nodules, and we had a special name for those. We just saw those the other day, what we call Peyer's patches. We've got quite a few pictures here on this page. I've got some more here on the next page, give you a view of the circular folds. We can see here on the right a series of intestinal villi, each of those little finger-like extensions. You can see them again here, and we've zoomed in on them even more here, where we can see the absorptive cells, the goblet cells, and whatnot, which is pretty cool. Nothing picture-wise. In fact, none of these pictures I'm going to worry about for the exam either. Just it's kind of too hard to tell things apart. Some more pictures here on the next page. This gives you a view of the other layers aside from the mucosa. You can see the submucosa and the muscularis. Here's some more microvilli extending from the cells. Here are those microvilli, just basically in a different view. Pretty cool to see that. Same thing over here. Here's some of those Peyer's patches. So some cool stuff, but nothing you need to worry about for the exam. Which leaves us with one final region to talk about, one final organ, the large intestine. All right, large intestine gets its name because it's much wider than the small intestine. It's not nearly as long. It's about half as long, about 5 to 6 feet. So it's still pretty long, but it's about 6 centimeters, which is about 2.5 inches in width, whereas the small intestine was about 1 inch in width. So it's significantly wider. And it is designed for absorbing water. This is where we pull in the last little bits of water that we've drank and allow it to enter the bloodstream. Key features of the large intestine. It has these little pouch-like structures, each of which is called a haustrum, whereas if you're pluralizing it, it is the term haustra. What takes place in these is really cool. Essentially, what we do is what's called haustral churning. We pass that chyme from haustra to haustra, and as we do, it circulates, it churns, and then it's passed, and then it's churned, and then it's passed. So that helps with the final aspects of digestion, and then the final aspects of absorption. They are created by gatherings of smooth muscle of the muscularis at regular distances. Also, a key feature of them are thickenings of the longitudinal muscles, which form 3 conspicuous bands which run the entire length of the large intestine. And you can see those here very nicely at the center. Those are called tenei coli. We see little pieces of fat kind of dripping down from them. Those are called omental appendices, which is another key feature of the large intestine. The large intestine consists of 2 key divisions, a cecum and a colon. The cecum, I mentioned on the last slide when talking about the small intestine, is the first 5 to 8 centimeters of the large intestine. So it's just a few inches in length. It is kind of a stupid structure, in my opinion, because it's a dead end. Okay. Here we can see the ileum, which is that little last piece of the small intestine that we can see. That chyme that's leaving the small intestine is going to come into the large intestine right here, where that ileocecal sphincter is located, which we just talked about on the previous page. Okay. What needs to happen at this point is that chyme needs to go up and into the ascending colon. But some of it's going to go down, and this is all on the lower right side of our abdomen into the cecum. And the cecum just goes nowhere. Okay. It's not very pronounced in humans, but it is much more a significant structure in other animals. Okay. So it does have a role much more in other animals instead of us. Okay. This is where that appendix or vermiform appendix comes from. The word vermiform means it kind of looks like a worm. It's attached to the tip of the cecum, and it obviously, as we know, functions in immunity. Attaching it is a mesoappendix to your abdominal wall, or I should say abdominal pelvic wall. Your colon is the rest of the large intestine, and is broken down into kind of 5 special regions. The first I've already mentioned is the ascending colon, which traverses up the right side of our abdomen. Then it takes a left turn and comes across via the transverse colon. And then we take another turn, except now we're going to go down via the descending colon. Okay. Now, where these 2 turns take place are what we call flexures. Here at the junction between the ascending and transverse colon is the right colic or hepatic flexure. It's called the right colic because it's on the right side, but it's called hepatic because remember the liver is going to be over here as well. The left colic or splenic flexure is called the left colic because it's on the left side. And then the splenic term comes from the fact that your spleen would be over here. Okay. So we go up, we go across, we go back down. Then we need to center ourselves up because if you think about it, where's your anus? It's in the center of your butt. Okay. Going towards the center of our abdominal pelvic region is the sigmoid colon. It's kind of an S shape, which is kind of handy because there's an S in the word sigmoid. You kind of have to be imaginative on that S shape, but it is an S shape. Then we go straight down towards the anus, which is the opening. And that straight down shot is the rectum, the last 7 or 8 inches, with the very last inch or so being the anal canal, which is what we can see. We zoom in on this little region. Okay, the anal canal is this last inch. The anus, not to be confused with the anal canal, is the opening. Now that anal canal is guarded by 2 sphincters. Okay, what we call the internal anal sphincter and the external anal sphincter. Internal is located internal, external is located external. Straightforward, as simple as that. Okay, what's different about them is that the external, as you can see in parentheses, and it's listed up here above, is voluntarily controlled, whereas the internal is involuntarily controlled, and that's because of the type of muscle that's found making it up. In the case of the internal, which is involuntarily controlled, it's involuntarily controlled because it's made up of smooth muscle. It's easy to remember IN for internal and IN for involuntary. That's the best piece of advice I can give you to remember that. And whereas the external, it's voluntary, and that's because it's made up of skeletal muscle. And this is what we gain control over when we, become potty trained little kids, and hopefully we'll be able to retain that voluntary control through the rest of our life so that we don't have to walk around wearing diapers all the time. Okay. So that's the kind of overall structure of the large intestine. Its wall, as we know, has 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Let's talk a little bit about the mucosa. Consists mainly of absorptive cells and goblet cells. So absorptive cells function primarily, obviously, in absorption of water. Goblet cells secrete mucus, which helps lubricate the passage of the colonic contents, so the contents in the colon. Both the absorptive and goblet cells are located in long, straight, tubular intestinal glands or crypts of Lieberkühn, which extend the full thickness of the mucosa. We can see those labeled here in the pictures at the bottom, and I guess I did. But there are solitary lymphatic nodules found in the lamina propria of the mucosa and extend through the muscular mucosae into the submucosa. Compared to the small intestine, the mucosa of the large intestine does not have as many structural adaptations to increase its surface area. So there's no circular folds and villi. There are microvilli though on those absorptive cells, but that's not going to be nearly as prominent, or I shouldn't say not as prominent, but not as efficient at increasing surface area as what you would have if you have the circular folds and the villi as well. Okay. And as a result, much more absorption actually takes place in the small intestine than in the large intestine. And kind of the same thing for digestion goes. There's not nearly as much digestion taking place in the large intestine. And in fact, a lot of the digestion that does actually take place in the large intestine is not actually done by the large intestine itself, but it's done by the bacteria, which kind of likes to break down things like carbohydrates. And as a result of that, it actually is what produces the gas that cause your farts to come from. So ever wonder where farts come from? It's because the bacteria in your colon. So kind of weird, but kind of cool at the same time. Make sure you know figure A, and I do actually want you to know figure B here for the exam. All right, any questions? Last page here I've got just gives you a view of the abdomen with the small intestine removed. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see it all, but you can see definitely the cecum's labeled. There's the ascending, there's the transverse, the descending, kind of see the sigmoid, and then where it's going to head down is the rectum. So kind of cool. Oh, I guess I did have a picture to show you some of those features. Just didn't realize it. But we got the 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis serosa. We can see the indentated cryptolea cocoon that I mentioned. Those tube-like glands, which we can see them a little bit better down here, zoomed in at the bottom. Not important images, so for the exam. So just make sure you know these two here on that previous page. All right, any questions? All right, well then that wraps us up for this unit.